morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm this session's facilitator, but I don't really need to facilitate the session because we only have one speaker with very interesting presentation, and we will leave about 10-15 minutes at the end for questions for you guys. So I'll be walking around with the mic as needed. My name is Luba Zarova. I'm a director of projects in the Department of Sustainability and Resilience. And we've worked with Maya for several months now. She was hired by BSC Group, who are our contractor to do the two Miyawaki forests. And it's been a real pleasure working with you and learning so much about these forests and getting our hands dirty and understanding the difference a little bit more between a Miyawaki forest and a regular forest. And I hope this will be an educational session for you as well. Just really quickly, a really quick bio of Maya. It's a little bit more than what you see on the back of the agendas. Maya is an environmental advocate and ecosystem restorer working to spread understanding on the key role of biodiversity in shaping the climate and the water, carbon, nutrient and energy cycles we rely on. She's passionate about climate change adaptation and mitigation and the ways that community-led ecosystem restoration can fight global climate change while improving the livelihood and equity of human communities. She works on project management, research, outreach, education, and advocacy efforts at Biodiversity for a Livable Climate. Having grown up in New York City and lived in cities all her life, Maya is interested in creating more natural infrastructure, biodiversity, and access to nature and ecological connection in urban areas, motivating her work on Miyawaki forests. She is a 2022 Tsuji Fellow and Forest Maker, a TED speaker, and has worked with Bio4Climate to plant the first Miyawaki forest in northeastern US. Please join me in welcoming Maya.
Thank you so much, Luba, and thank you all so much for being here. Really excited to talk to you all today and hopefully not talk too long so that we can get out there and get planting. So I'll just keep an eye on my time. So we're really here to talk about Miyawaki forests and the way that they can help us in restoring nature in urban environments and areas of ecological degradation. So here in Worcester, right in the heart of downtown. And a little bit of background on kind of why and how we're taking this approach really relies on understanding biodiversity and climate and the way that these relate. So I work for an organization that Luba mentioned, Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, Bio4Climate, and it's all kind of in the name there that biodiversity is understood not just to be a passive victim of climate change, but a very much active ally in shaping the climate and the conditions of life. And that healthy ecosystems and restored ecosystems can help us restore balance in the water cycle, the energy cycle, the carbon cycle, and all of these pieces of a healthy planet and healthy communities. This approach involves kind of shifting away from a focus in the climate conversation just on carbon and carbon emissions to appreciating the systems that govern life on our planet, which involve carbon, but also water, nutrients, energy, and all of these kind of aspects that we more tangibly interact with in the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, and indeed our ways of kind of living in spaces, transporting ourselves places, and interacting with one another and the environment around us. So this kind of technique, ecosystem restoration, looking at creating more healthy, thriving ecosystems for balance, for a healthier planet, involves kind of changing our relationship to our ecosystems and creating resilience, which John touched on as kind of the ways that we go forward in a changing system, bounce back from crisis events, deal with extreme conditions of heat, of precipitation, of all of the kind of extremes that are coming down the pipeline with climate change and global warming. So as we kind of change our relationship and become stewards of healthy ecosystems, we can really create much more resilient communities that are better able to help us all thrive. So this is kind of where the Miyawaki forest comes in. Miyawaki forest, in short, is a very dense biodiverse pocket forest that recreates an area's natural ecosystem. And so we are planting in a biodiverse array of native species in just a few hundred square meters or a few thousand square feet. One of the things that really attracts people to this method is the idea that it can be done in a very small size, a minimum of about 1,000 square feet or 6 parking spaces across, which we'll be seeing out here in Worcester today. We're going to be in more like 8,000 square feet, but still much smaller than what you think of as your acres and acres of forest. This is attractive for many reasons. Number one being that in a lot of our urban spaces where we've already developed so much, we can't really extract much of what we've done to change things around to just give over to natural habitat. So these forests are a way of coexisting with nature, stewarding those natural habitats, but also placing them in the places where people live and work and learn, so that you're not leaving where you are to go visit nature, but nature is a part of where you are and where you belong. This is a 100% natural process, one that doesn't involve synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides. Instead, we are creating an ecosystem that self-sustains and self-regulates. We are creating an ecosystem out of native trees and shrubs at various kind of heights and levels of the forest to maximize that biodiversity, both in the species that we're picking and also in the species that they are supporting. The insects, the invertebrates, the birds, the small mammals, all of the pollinators and other creatures that make that full ecosystem. And that ecosystem will then in turn support the greater food web. It will support all of the other kind of life reliant processes that we have to create clean air, clean water, healthy soils that produce nutrient dense foods. So all of these things we're starting to seed into our small area. We create a very dense planting with this method that creates a very dense canopy, filtering airborne pollutants. So next to the highway, next to these large streets, we are starting to take away some of those effects of air pollution. And of course, our favorite function of trees, they sequester carbon and emit oxygen, kind of the natural complement to us human beings. We also have a very rapidly grown forest. And this allows us to create a self-sustaining ecosystem in just a few years. We have a few years of maintenance and stewardship, after which the forest is naturally suppressing any encroaching growth. And one of the benefits that I love to focus on as well is that this is blue-green infrastructure as well, because as we plant these forests, we create really porous forest floors that are able to process stormwater, infiltrate into the ground, raise our water table, and therefore combat the kind of drought and flooding cycles that are becoming much more common as we have these intense years of drought and flooding and precipitation. And finally, these are all done by community members. They're planted by community members and stewarded by community members. People are really taking that direct action that they are doing themselves to create a greener and more beautiful city. So a lot of these benefits are really focused on creating healthier systems. And one of the ones that I really like to focus on is cooling, because extreme heat is becoming more and more intense in our urban areas. We have the urban heat island effect, whereby all of the concrete, the asphalt, the glass, the built environment that we've created re-radiates heat in a way that the sun's energy has no place to go. This creates really dire conditions for people to live in, and AC and shade structures and things like that aren't enough to keep up with this intense condition. So nature is one really powerful ally in keeping the earth cool and buffering these extremes. And this is just a photo, a snapshot from the city of Melbourne on a summer day, where there is a kind of vegetated, shaded area of trees that is about 25 degrees Celsius cooler than the hot pavement around it. And that's about 50-degree Fahrenheit difference. And so that is a really tremendous gap. And this is the way in which that by building in more natural infrastructure, more tiles of nature in our cityscapes, we can really make an immediate difference so that all of the heat deaths and the adverse health outcomes that we're already facing today, not waiting for any projections into the future, we can build in that natural buffer to our spaces so that we have more equitable access to cooling and to nature. And of course, it's not just about cooling. That is a really powerful benefit of these forests, and one of the reasons that we have placed them where we have here in Worcester. But we also have kind of a systems approach in which we're getting not only that cooling, but also some of the beauty, also some of the air pollution filtration, some of the habitat for pollinators. And so all of this is working together to increase the benefits that come to our city when we do this. And I like to just touch on a couple of the really exciting impacts of the mini forest. Again, they can be done in quite small areas. And I think this is really important for the issue of environmental justice and equity. We don't have to kind of recreate from scratch any of the kind of big systems of natural cooling and buffering. We can instead very strategically employ this method in the areas that it's needed most. In our heat islands, our areas of intense pollution, which are always are often concentrated in the most marginalized communities, in Black and Brown communities, immigrant communities, low-income communities. And these are ways in which we can't necessarily be creating central parks all over the place. I like to look at New York because it's been really well documented what the heat disparity looks like in different areas. But we can start to take an approach to tile in some green, tile in some blue-green infrastructure, and create ways for people to participate in the beautifying, the greening, and the kind of resilience proofing of their communities, because this is a way that we get in the ground and start to steward our ecosystems and not just watch as someone else kind of pollutes things or degrades things. Instead, we're taking on the responsibility of seeding something new. We're spreading that education of what our native ecology looks like. We don't have to go far away to learn what an oak tree is, or how it looks during different seasons, or what the different acorns are from pin oak to bur oak. We can see all of that where we are when we start to create these in our neighborhoods, in our schoolyards, and near our libraries. So these are footholds for all of these benefits for the education, the stewardship, community resilience, and of course, biodiversity as well. So the origin of this method, it actually traces its roots pretty far back. We only have Miyawaki forests in the US for the past few years, but this actually started in the 1970s with Dr. Akira Miyawaki, who was a Japanese botanist and ecologist who pioneered this method based on decades of his own work and observation, and his understanding of the kind of natural vegetation and potential ecosystems around him, and his understanding of ecological succession, basically the way that ecosystems and environments change over time. So the kind of beautiful piece of this story is that in a very deforested and industrialized area, he could see the pieces of old growth forests that were preserved in shrines, that these sacred forests that hadn't been cut down had actually a representative slice of what the forest had looked like hundreds of years before all of this damage had erased it from acres and acres. And so using that information of what species were in combinations with one another, what were combining to make that kind of rich forest flora and ecosystem, he could choose the selection of species that he wanted to reforest with, and also try to do some of the work of establishing a healthy forest floor and living ecosystem beyond just the vegetation. A lot of us look at a forest and think it's just trees, But a lot of the time, most of the exciting work is being done underground. That's where those rich, dense root systems are. And it's not just the roots of vegetation, it's the microbial communities and the fungal communities that are in relationship to the trees that are really fostering a lot of the nutrient exchange, a lot of the water exchange, and creating that healthy forest that can respond to threats like pests and disease, can communicate in these beautiful networks underground. And so Miyawaki basically thought to himself, the idea behind ecological succession is that if you leave alone a natural area for a while, it will start to change. It will start to develop. What we commonly refer to as weeds often come into your yard because they want to do some work there. They'll set themselves up, get their root systems in, start photosynthesizing, start changing the conditions so that a few years later, some new species can come in, some perennial herbs, grasses and forbs, after a couple of decades, some shrubs and some pioneering trees, and eventually you'll have a climax ecosystem established that is a steady state, a stable ecosystem in about 100 to 200 years, because each of these stages of succession are changing the conditions and allowing new things to take root and thrive. And Miyawaki thought, instead of waiting for this process and simply leaving things alone, what if humans could come in as active participants and start to prepare the soil in certain ways to get to that climax ecosystem a bit faster? So part of this method really involves the soil remediation, loosening all of that compacted and degraded soil that we have in our urban ecosystems to create a place that roots can penetrate, adding in some nutrition, some ability to retain water, jumpstarting that microbial and fungal community, and then planting in a composition of species that we believe will do well here, that reflects the natural ecosystem here, and that reflects largely the climax forest ecosystem of this area. So this is a way in which humans can not only watch and see nature thrive, but actually jumpstart that ecosystem and do what nature could not do as fast alone. The steps and the growth involve first selecting a site. Once you have a place that you want to plant this, like the library, like Plumley Village Housing, like in front of your schoolyard, in front of your hospital, your health center, you start to analyze what are the conditions of that site, understand what is in the soil chemistry and the soil biology, and then understand the species that would have grown there by surveying existing natural areas and also bringing in your supplemental information of what did the people living here eat and forage and grow, what are our kind of missing histories of the species that were here, and choose species to create that rich biodiverse network from the shrub and understory to medium level trees to larger and tall canopy trees. We do some pretty intense soil engineering. So that's when we're kind of digging down to about a meter to loosen up the soil. Then we are bringing in some compost, some mulch, some water retaining materials, some perforating materials to allow our root system to more effectively establish itself. We're planting quite densely, generally about 3 to 7 plants per square meter, or about like 1-ish plant per square foot. You'll see that outside and in the way that we plant today. And then we, for a couple of years, steward the forest actively. And this maintenance involves removing weeds or early successional species that can grow really fast and kind of displace or outpace our trees and the ecosystem that we're trying to establish. And, you know, this is no shade to those species. They're just trying to do their job, but we have a design in mind for this forest. So we remove those species in those first couple of years as they try to outcompete what we have planted in, and we add water. Which, especially in the summer and in our drought years, is really essential for the forest survival. But after about 3 years or 2 to 3 years of this maintenance, we let the forest self-sustain. And this is a huge difference from a lot of the tree plantings that we do in cities or in our built environments, where we plant our street trees or we plant our kind of areas, and then we expect to keep maintaining it for years and years to come. In this case, what we are doing by creating ecosystem, not just standalone trees, is letting the forest regulate the encroaching growth and outshade it with its dense canopy that develops in that fast-growing way in a couple of years, and let those deep roots that establish draw in their own water, deal themselves with any kind of drought or other issues, over rain, things like that, that might come up. And we found that these forests, because of their biodiversity, because of these different ecological niches that different species fill, are really quite resilient. They have very high survival rates, about 95% generally in the first few years, after which some things die off, but all that biomass remains in the system. And generally the forest itself, that we plant here, steward for 3 years, is going to go on and live for hundreds of years beyond us, which is a really exciting thing for me to think about as I plant out there of like what I'm seeding into the future that will last much beyond my lifetime. So this is the first forest that we planted in the Northeast US, just kind of a little bit that way in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Danahy Park. And we planted it in September of 2021. And in just a couple of years, the forest has really shot up. Its tallest trees are now about 24 feet tall. And we have this really dense, beautiful canopy that has developed. So this is kind of a look into the future as we plant here in Worcester, to see in a couple of years the types of changes that you will see develop in the McGrath Lot Forest and in the Plumley Village Forest. Our second forest in Cambridge that we did in November of 2022, in just a year, has again really flourished. You see kind of some of the intermediate growth that happens in just a year's time. And we get to see a lot of the result of really creating that healthy ecosystem and relying on much more than just the human design behind this work. Really, all ecosystem restoration, and particularly the Miyawaki forest that we're talking about today, relies on working with allies. A huge group of human allies and community members who are planting this, and also all of these non-human beings that are in the soil and coming in to help with the ecosystem. So, I have a picture here of chloroplasts, and my colleague calls these, 2 billion year old field tested carbon sucking technology. This is the way that we can turn carbon into biomass, into sugars, without any harm and with a whole lot of positive benefits. And we are really relying on that for that fast upward growth, for bringing sugars into the system, feeding those into the microbes and fungi, and letting those establish that beautiful root system that can then filter water. And so I also have a picture here of a lovely young pine seedling whose root system really only goes a little ways out. It's in the small yellow ring right around the base of the pine. And the rest of this beautiful kind of cranial root network is all mycorrhizal fungi. And so the fungi are playing this really beautiful role in the system to kind of trade resources, be part of the communication, and as people have kind of dug into, really allow trees to essentially talk to each other, to alert one another of threats, to share sugars and other nutrients and minerals. And this is all a really essential part of creating that living forest floor. So what we see is a lot more than just the trees. And of course, there are the people involved. We're out here planting as a community, we're mulching and weeding, and we're monitoring and maintaining, which is really essential to see not only the growth rates and survival rates, but also biodiversity and the health of the forest overall. We can watch as kind of the fungal networks develop and we see the fruiting mushrooms. We can watch and see as the species change over the seasons, put out fruits like the blueberry. We can watch and see as insects come into the space, as larger insects like dragonflies eat smaller ones, as small mammals start to appear and use the space. And we can also observe the change over the seasons. We can see the flowering, the blooming, and the development of this deep, rich ecosystem. By year 2, in our forest, we see a really dense interior in which it's quite dark. We're out competing any other growth. We have a very humid and moisture cycling kind of microbiome. And we see the trees far outstrip their human counterparts. So that's all kind of a look ahead into the future of the Miyawaki forests in Worcester. And so this movement is much bigger than what we're doing here today. There are forests around the world, school forests, regional forests here in Cambridge, Somerville, Natick, other communities and counting, and so many opportunities for planting, for education, and for starting things like saplings and planting early. We get a lot of people to come out and take part, either planting their first tree or planting, their 100th. And it's a lot of fun to get to know your community members this way and to start thinking about the ways that we can take this work forward, and start doing these at our schools, at our health centers, to start to think about the edible native species in these, or ways of designing Miyawaki forests to complement food forests that are just focusing on food rather than native species. We can start thinking about biodiversity corridors and cooling corridors, all of the research that can be done on the health impacts, community impacts, soil, moisture, temperature. And we can start to also kind of garner that greater appreciation for native plants and trees, for all sorts of natural infrastructure, not just Miyawaki forests, but pollinator gardens, rain gardens, other things that are part of kind of the Cool Pocket design process that the city of Worcester is currently undertaking. And I just want to share kind of one takeaway as well. As we plant these forests, know that this is a complement to preserving intact forests, intact mature trees. We need all of the nature that we can get. So this is not an offset method. This is something that we want to do to bring those benefits to the places that we are, while also keeping wild spaces intact. And again, this is something that you and I and tons of community members can only do together. Planting these is no small feat. So we really need the hundreds of people that are coming out to plant over a couple of planting days. We're going to be planting later today at McGrath Lot. We're going to have people sign up for ongoing stewardship of these forests. Green Worcester is going to continue running its Cool Pocket design workshops. And then we're also planting next week at Plumley Village. We have a planting date next Saturday. So in the morning and the afternoon, please come out and enjoy transforming this beautiful space with us. Please keep up with our projects and start documenting now, because the transformation is really stark, and we want to know what you're seeing in these forests, what you're seeing in their development, in their health, and in their growth. And I encourage you also to come out to some of the other forests that Biodiversity for a Livable Climate has done. We've just had a couple Earth Day and Biodiversity Day events at Danahy Park, our oldest forest, and we have a handful around the Boston, Cambridge, Natick area. So please volunteer at our projects, join us in person and online for classes and events talking about not just the mini forest, but other types of ecosystem restoration. And stay tuned, of course, for photos and videos on this project, because we're so excited to do this kind of depaving and transformation all the way into a thriving ecosystem. And I just want to remind everyone that you're really involved in essential work here. John Liu called ecosystem restoration the great work of our time. This is a direct way to cool the climate, to make water and food more available, to increase health, resilience, biodiversity, and of course, the power of people and communities coming together to do transformation. So thank you so much for being a part of it. We're so happy to have you all here, hopefully planting today and next Saturday, and keeping up and volunteering with this project and others. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you, Maya. That was great. We have 10 minutes for questions. I will just pass on the mic. If anyone has any. Somebody?
I haven't been I came up from Connecticut. I'm on a board of a condo association in Connecticut. I've written you about it. And we live on the side of a mountain with heavy clay soils. And my question is, one, is this ever done on a slope?
Yes, these are done on we try to avoid too steep a slope of less than 45, which is pretty extreme, and sometimes put in some kind of erosion control mechanism for planting on a slope. it's a little slower process for volunteers. But even at Plumley Village, we have a slight grade, about 20%, and these can be done, up to about 45%.
Our environment is the clay soils. It was originally forested, it was cleared for agriculture, and then reforested naturally. We have about 250 acres of forest in our community. It's just grown. Some of it was planted by the developer. In a condo situation, we won't have a volunteer labor.
Mhm.
Could you help us get a handle on costs for labor and costs, things like this?
So generally, we plant these with volunteers for a number of reasons, really to involve community members in taking a hand in ongoing stewardship, in ownership of this project and protection of it. So we haven't worked before with hired kind of manual labor because it is quite extensive, not just to plant, but to keep coming back and volunteer. So I don't really have a good handle on that sort of labor cost. There is also considerable cost in just preparing the soil to do some of that kind of intensive remediation. So that is, again, where it's really helpful to work with a Department of Public Works, your municipality, or some sort of public resource. And doing this on public land allows us to kind of tap into that to do some of the kind of harder parts of the labor. Yeah.
Okay, I'll pass it on.
Thank you.
I'll ask you some specific questions later on.
Sounds good.
And you're welcome to reach out to us because the city's managing this project. We have a sense of the costs, actual costs, and volunteer labor that went into it. So maybe it can help you out with that. And yeah, check out Plumley Village. It was very interesting to see how that slope was terraced, and stakes were like put in to stabilize it.
Thank you so much. Great. So informative and learned a lot. I was wondering kind of like how scalable this is, and are there, like, it's great to see that there's forests of different sizes, but are there ways, I guess, like, is there, and this sounds kind of counterintuitive, but can we like learn about our larger natural forests from these like little mini native forests? And then what's like the largest size that a Miyawaki forest could be?
That's a great question. So a lot of people really focus on the mini aspect, but these don't have to be all that many. The largest kind of mini forest projects that I'm aware of are about 10,000 square feet, and we're kind of bordering on that at Plumley Village. But originally, Miyawaki also did much larger projects than that and had kind of a simplified soil remediation and a simplified species survey that he would then use to cover, a couple of acres at a time. So there is less potential to do as intensive a dig or as much kind of biodiversity in a concentrated area because you are, really taking on the scale challenge there. But there are adaptations to the method that could allow you to, work more at that scale. And the second part of your question, remind me.
It was more like, what can we learn?
Oh, yes. In the small area, what do we learn about the larger natural ecosystem? Well, I think we start to learn, especially for those who are not themselves really immersed in their surrounding nature and in the trails and the stewardship, we start to learn about kind of what constitutes soil health and the way that that healthy ecosystem looks versus some of the trees that we just pass by on the street on a day-to-day. We start to learn about kind of what visits them, what sorts of insects and pollinators eat that food or make a habitat there. And I think we also get a really in-depth relationship with some of those native species, because as we come by over time and monitor this forest, we are watching that grow and starting to see those subtle changes in each season. When things bloom, when things grow, we start to see different effects of kind of the species working together versus being in a standalone condition. And I think a lot of that learning of a more individual relationship with each of these kind of natural parts of our communities can then translate out to what we see and the way that we look at other natural spaces that we step into. I think it really changes your perspective a lot. Yeah.
So this is really getting into the weeds, pun intended. So in the Cambridge picture, the 2023 picture, it looked like a lot of what you see with sumac, which I think of as an opportunistic weed tree. So I was curious as to whether, and the stuff you were saying about the tall stuff was way behind it, whether that was, what happens with a tree like that? Is that part of what you would take out because you want to encourage the more, the things you planted, or is that going to be a subject to natural succession at that point? I was really surprised to see that kind of tree being part of it. So I wondered sort of what was the status of species like that that are, as I said, I think of as, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of as being these opportunistic things that come in when there's disturbed soils. And so what happens with that?
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair question. I don't think of it as a weed per se, but I know it is kind of an aggressive grower. And so, a sumac is not going to be the kind of climax dominating tree of this ecosystem, but it is part of that initial quick growth and starting to create that really dense shade structure. I think we have a little bit too much of it in our Danahee forest, where it is generally concentrated on edges rather than kind of spread throughout an area. But in this forest, I'm not too worried about it kind of being the dominant species forever, because even as it develops, it starts to get branch breaks and to start to kind of siphon out over years while other things are moving into that space, slower growing, starting to take over that canopy. But we definitely have changed around a little bit as we learn from our first forest where we want to plant certain species and why. And some people share your distaste for staghorn sumac and have not wanted to plant them at all in forests. So those were planted. They were not moved in. They were part of our original species. Yeah. Thank you.
This is extraordinary, wonderful, excellent. I am concerned about the enemies of these projects, current and in the future, human and corporate and profit and greed. What is done, or what has been done, to be able to protect against, and community builders owns Plumley Village. It's not government-owned property, right? What is being done, what can be done to protect against some future folks coming along and saying this would be a great place for luxury condos, and wiping out what we spend however much time and effort putting in. Parkland in Massachusetts has to be decertified by legislative vote, but it's automatic. When any legislator comes in and says, my town wants to knock down this park and put in a school, the legislature all scratches each other's backs. So it always happens. It never fails when they bring that up. But at least for public parkland, that's a requirement. It's not required at all for some private development company like Community Builders.
Yeah.
So has this come up as an issue, and what if anything would your organization recommend as a strategy to protect against somebody in the future deciding the parking lot is more important than the climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely don't want to undo all of this work that we kind of put in for good reason. So there's various levels of kind of legality you can build into this. On a basic level, kind of a memorandum of understanding or some sort of agreement that this space will continue to be protected, that this will not just exist for 20 years when it hasn't even developed into its fullness yet, and be changed. So generally, before we embark on these projects, when we have stakeholders like the city, like the places that we're planting, whether it's a school or a library or housing complex, we have those stakeholders come to an agreement that this is a forest and will continue to be a forest. And I don't know that we have like a legally binding repercussion every single case. But I think that is the most secure that we can get with it. And also really getting people from the start and continue to be involved with the project that will fight for it too. I think that's, again, one of the really important functions of having a community forest is this is not something that I'm going to come in and make in your community and I am the person who is, running this project forever. And so we need people like you to make sure that no one gets up to anything nefarious here in terms of taking it down or damaging it or changing the ultimate function. But I think from a basic level, just making an agreement, making that in writing, making it known that this is a forest and is not intended to be, remediated for someone else to come along and change.
Try community land trust as a preserve, to become the owner of the property as a long-term preserving agent. I think that's a better protection than even municipal government.
We've had requests from community land trust to do this on their land. We haven't yet kind of done that transformation from a public space to a land trust, but definitely something that, I'd be happy to have done, because I think that kind of model of community ownership is a really important model that we have for conserving and restoring, ecosystems. Yeah.
And I just wanted to quickly add, we don't, for Montreal, we don't have a binding preservation agreement in place. There is a municipal parking lot and a lot of community support. They are pilots, so it is something that can be considered in the future. There, I can think of 3 ways to permanently preserve: conservation restriction and easement, which are moved into a mini parkland. But we haven't explored, we're just focusing on putting it in and having it thrive. At Plumley Village, you're right, it's privately owned low-income housing. And it was a little difficult to approach them and get them to agree to participate, but the parcel of where we're planting is non-buildable. So the threat of them building on it is non-existent. Really, it's on a slope next to a highway. And so once they understood that the value of it and that they don't have to compensate us or pay for it, then and we talked about risks. So we are working on MOU. There will be a hidden agreement about it. It's not legally enforced, but it is a pretty strong statement in itself. So it's something to be considered because it's a long-term investment in a forest that will be here for hundreds of years. We do have our food has arrived for lunch, but I know that maybe one more quick question. Okay, 3 minutes. Well, that if we can go like a rapid fire.
Sure.
But if you guys are hungry, you can navigate to food. We do have over an hour for lunch. So if you want to stick around, you can keep on asking questions.
Yeah, I'm just, could you give us kind of a sense of the Connex trees and how they're doing? Because they're figured out at the beginning. Just tell us what you're seeing after a couple of years at Denny and other places.
Yeah, some of the slower growing trees are indeed slower growing, but they're chugging along. So some of our kind of red oaks, we have a couple of white pines, we have some hickories in there. And so these trees that are, going to be 80 feet tall are still in their, 5 to 10 foot stage, but they're healthy, they're alive, they're keeping on growing, finding the sunlight where they can, and pushing through. Yeah.
I just want to calculate, so I don't know where is the forest going to be in Worcester?
Yep, McGrath Lot, right here at the library. We're kind of on the right or left side, right near the kind of main street. So you can plant there later today, and then at Plumley Village, which is not too far away from here either, at 16 Laurel Street, we are going to be planting next Saturday, so please come out for that. We definitely could use you and your friends and some more volunteers. Yeah.
So how many trees are you planting?
So we're planting a couple thousand trees in each area. It's a very dense planting. So we have potted plants and bare root trees that we've done bare root installation already, and now we're adding in some container plants.
Thank you very much. So if you have specific questions, you can direct it to the city and we'll make sure they get answered.
Or you can find me at bioforclimate.org. We have some info sessions so people can sign up and go a little bit more in depth on those, and find my email there as well. Yeah, and I'll try to get to them in a somewhat timely manner when not planting.
Thank you very much.